Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna watch a video from Prager University. It's a short history of slavery, and I believe Candace Owens is the one who's talking about this. It will be pretty interesting. And yeah, slavery is, one of the oldest sort of, not traditions, but practices that humans have done to each other, right? This is as old as humans, almost, right? I don't know if Neanderthals did this, but Homo sapiens definitely did this, right? So, yeah, let's get into this. Original videos down below, and let's go.
And now for a brief history of
Yeah,
slavery.
it's Candace Owens.
Here's the first thing you need to know.
Yeah.
Slavery was not invented by white people.
Okay, so the first point here. Okay. No, as I said, slavery was not invented per se by white people. It was invented by humans. Doesn't matter the color of skin, and slavery was not based on color of skin or what's it called, melanin in the skin, right? It's not based on that, right? That's a very new way of looking into slavery. The tens of thousands of years human had done slavery to each other was usually to people who looked like themselves, right? But their community was weaker than yours, right? And you just took them as slaves. Look at the Romans, look in the Balkans, look in North Africa, look in the Middle East, look in China, look in the Pacific Islands. Think about this logically or practically, right? How would you do 2,000 years ago? How would you go from, let's say you're in China, how would you go to North Africa and take a slave there and then go back to China? You would probably die on the way, so it wouldn't be that practical and it wouldn't be that smart, so you would just enslave another Chinese person, right? Or another European or another North African, right? Like, it's just how it is. Sadly, slavery existed and still exists now in another shape or form, but still exists, right? Pretty sad. That's life. In the animal kingdom, I don't think we see it as much. We maybe see sort of in a... no, we don't see it like that. It's more of a human invention, right? It's not invented by white people, it's invented by humans. Doesn't matter the color of skin, right? That's just a new kind of way of looking at it.
It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then.
Yeah.
It did not start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner.
This is true. Like I said, you can go back to earlier parts of human history. You would have a strong tribe. Doesn't matter which continent in the world you're talking about. A stronger tribe would prey on the weaker tribe because the strong tribe wants food, and the weaker tribe might have food, and the strong tribe might want money if a monetary system was back then. And then the strong tribe would just attack the weak tribe, enslave them, take their women and children, enslave the men to work or whatever, and take their food, take their money, and sell the slaves. Doesn't matter which continent, doesn't matter how they look, it's because their community was weaker than the other, or tribe, right? And then a strong tribe might buy in another strong tribe to together attack a weak but a big tribe to just enslave, right? Sadly, that's how it is.
Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East.
The old world.
The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of Eastern Europe. Millions.
Exactly. Which is weird. Slavery existed in Europe as well pretty later on, because humans didn't go to Europe that quickly. Like Homo sapiens didn't go to Europe that quickly because it was colder, right? And I believe actually North Africa and Africa in a whole was, North Africa in particular, because now it's Sahara or desert, right? But back then it was pretty green, right? Especially Egypt, right? Pretty green. Why would you go out of that? Maybe to escape a strong tribe that was going to enslave you, maybe, right? And to find more animals to hunt, so you can build your own community, right? That would make sense to go to Europe. Slavs is slaves, yes, because other Slavs, like I said, in Balkans or in Eastern Europe, enslaved each other. Which is sad, but true.
Of them, all white by the way, were captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks. Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries. Slavery existed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the 4th century.
I mean, talking about the Roman Empire there, right? In a previous video about the Roman Empire, we saw or heard that when Caesar attacked France, today France, but Gaul, he killed 1 million Gauls and took almost 1 million slaves, right? It's normal practice. It's you can say, nowadays you can say it's inhumane, but when that practice was used in the entire known world, or entire world, because people lived, entire world, then it's more than inhumane. I mean, if 90% or 95% of the population, or not 90, but if the majority of the population in the world are using slavery in a way, either to buy slaves to use to help build something, or sell slaves, or capture slaves, right? Then it's humane because majority of humans are doing it. It's still inhumane practice, but it's. I don't think any ruler or any person that wasn't a slave, or even a slave back then, like in 4th century, I don't think any one of these people would roll in the graves and say, "Oh, slavery was so bad," right? Right? It's just what the practice. It's like nowadays we all have cell phones. I don't think anyone would roll in the grave right now in 250 years when people look back and say, "Oh, they use cell phones. That's so bad," right? That we wouldn't roll in our graves. We just use cell phones and that's it, right? Nothing wrong with that.
BC. It was so common that Aristotle simply considered it natural. The slave master model was just how
that's what I mean. It's so common. It was so common back then that it's not inhumane, because majority of people are in some ways are practicing it, or would practice it if push comes to shove, right? From our point of view now, from our high horse, we say it's inhumane, which it is. But if back then majority of people were somehow involved in it, then it's not inhumane in that sense. But
the world operated in the great philosopher's day. Slavery existed during the time of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. As far back as we can go in human history, we find slavery. As renowned historian John Steele Gordon notes from time immemorial, slaves were a major item of commerce. As much as a third of the population of the ancient world was enslaved.
I mean, you can just look at a video I did back there before on Rome again. What was it? The ancient 20 minutes of ancient history of Rome, right? I don't know if it was 40% of, I don't know if it was Rome the city during Spartacus rebellion. 40% of the city or the empire were slaves, right? and they crucified Spartacus and like 4,000, 8,000 slaves that rebelled, and that was a show for saying to the 40% of the population who were slaves, saying you shouldn't rebel, right? That's, yeah, sadly it's true what this says, right? Sadly.
Here's the second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies.
This is true. Again, you can argue against it, saying, oh, just because it's an act doesn't mean it will be put forward. But like the Bill of Rights in the US, right? Freedom of speech. Just because you put it in doesn't mean it's going to uphold. Who's going to uphold that, right? But because the US, the founders, even though they had slaves, most of them would want to see the end of slavery, but they knew they couldn't just end it like that, because that would just be a civil war. People would die, right? So they knew it would actually, in like 50 years, 60 years, slavery would end and integration would begin, right? But sadly, it had to take a civil war in the US to end that. And then it didn't stop there, but they had to quickly go. And US is the perfect place to see this. How old is the US? Not that old, 200 years. The rest of the countries in the world, in the old world especially, right? Europe, Asia, Africa. How long did it take? In China, there's still slavery, right? Another form of slavery, but still slavery. The argument against it is that, oh, it's just an act. It doesn't mean anything. But an act could, in 60 years, 40 years, be practical. And I believe the British Navy actually patrolled ships that was going from West Africa to the Caribbean, right? And seized them and put the ships back to West Africa, right? So they did it practically as well. Okay.
Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution.
Yeah.
After centuries of human slavery,
Exactly.
White men led the world.
Again, the same argument against the 13th Amendment, or not against it, but saying that, oh, just an amendment doesn't mean anything, right? It does mean something. It doesn't mean that the effect of the amendment will go in right away, and it doesn't mean that the effect that you want this to do doesn't mean it will do what it says it will do, right? You understand what I'm saying? But I mean, the argument against this again is that it's just an amendment, doesn't mean have to do anything, and practically it didn't do anything like that, like quickly, but 40 years later, right? No problem. But
and putting an end to the abhorrent practice.
Yep.
That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War. Now, am I saying that this makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth, and the truth is that human history is complicated. No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless.
Yep.
Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire.
I think it was Thomas Sowell that said, talking about reparations, right, in the US particularly, right, saying that he talked about the world actually. He said a quote from someone else: if you were going to give reparations to former slaves, and the money comes from, not former slaves, descendants of former slaves in the world, and they were given the money by descendants of slave owners, then we would probably give the ratio would probably be 95% would get money from the 5%, or even 100%, because some point somewhere in history of your or your ancestors, somewhere in history, either your ancestor were a slave or a slave owner, somewhere in how many thousands of years of human history, right? somewhere. Are you going to say, oh, 200 years ago, my ancestor was a slave, and you ancestor were a slave owner, so I should get money 200 years ago? But if you go back 300 years ago, it was the reverse. So who gets the money? No one, right? So, right? If you had a time machine, you can go back and do something. I don't know what you were going to do. If you said something, you would probably be enslaved yourself. Doesn't matter where you were. If you go back to Roman time, ancient times, right? But, okay.
Empire, or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America, or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few. Instead, we're told that slavery is a white...
It's funny though, because everything bad and good comes from humans. Doesn't matter which continent, doesn't matter which country, nation, community, doesn't matter. Good and bad people everywhere. Right? That's why we humans sin, because we're good and bad. Doesn't matter where.
Phenomenon. And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies. On social media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true.
I mean, this is true and false, right? If we look at the context, what she said, European way made these kings and queens took away their nations. Maybe because they had slaves, I don't know. And maybe European powers, particularly in Africa, built up kings and queens in Africa who were against slaves or perceived against slaves, right? But then again, it doesn't matter. This has happened through human history. It doesn't matter which nation, continent, right? In the Middle East against Africa, Africa against Middle East, China against Middle East, like the Mongols against the rest of the 3 continents. Like, this is nothing new. And I know some historians will say, but no one says it's a white phenomenon, right? No one says that, says the historians. It's in a bubble. When you're a historian, you're in a bubble. You know more of history than the normal person, day-to-day person, right? So it's easy for you to say, as a historian, no one says this, right? This is not taught in any school in Western world, right? People who know this is people who go outside school and learn after school, right? Historians live in a bubble, sadly. Maybe it's for the better, so they don't get outside influence. Could be so, but then they're naive and saying that no one thinks like this, no one says this. But then just go on social media. I know social media isn't the best representative of what people think, but it is though, in a way, right? Anyway.
But it's not. It's a fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other Black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior
weapons, particularly. More weapons, because they would want weapons so they can hunt more slaves. But I mean, like I said, Balkans did this against Balkans. East Europeans did this against East Europeans. Native British, whatever called, I don't know what they called, whatever. They did this against themselves. This happened everywhere. Everybody did it to themselves and others who looked like them, because they were the neighbor, right? And they were weaker than you, so you took advantage. That's how it is.
Round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their Black partners to bring them Black bodies. The stark reality is that
sadly, because this is sad. Why couldn't the Europeans go into Central Africa? Because they would die of disease, right? Same as the Native Americans did when the Europeans came to Americas, right? They died of disease, right? Whole empires were destroyed by disease alone before any European even were near their empire, right? And when the Europeans created medicine so they can go into the interior of Africa, they have already abolished slavery, those nations that went into Africa. So then they were fighting against slavery.
Lives had very little value to our ancestors. Here's the third thing you need to know. If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today, right now. That's the lowest estimate that I could find. Other sources.
Only in Africa, though. In China or Asia, this is true. South America, maybe. Right? This is sad. I don't know if 700,000, probably more, right? Because all this electronic stuff, the raw material is somewhat from Africa, and it's from mines that are dug by children, right? Or impoverished people, right? So this is sad that it still exists today. Very sad.
Sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States. Child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor, these are the conditions that currently exist within the same sub-Saharan region where the transatlantic slave trade originated. African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then, and no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men. In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries. But we hear almost nothing about that. Just like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago. Why? Because our so-called leaders, black and white, wouldn't profit from it. Black victimhood is nothing if not profitable. It elects politicians and funds racial grievance groups. And if Black Americans began to view themselves as partners in the American dream, if we embraced the patriotic spirit that holds all men are created equal, the patriotic spirit that is our real heritage, then the race hustlers would soon be out of business. And who wants that? I'm Candace Owens, author of Blackout for Prager University.
I mean, that was a pretty cool video, right? First video I ever seen of Prager University. That was cool. Pretty concise, right? Gave us some numbers, some context, right? Okay. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.